Our next speaker is Richard Cole. Richard Cole enlisted in 1940 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in July 1941 after pilot training. He served in the China-Burma-India Theater. Richard was James Doolittle's co-pilot in Aircraft No. 1 on the Tokyo raid in 1942. After the war, he served as an operations advisor to the Venezuelan Air Force, and then peacetime served in the United States. His decorations include the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, Air Medal with oak leaf cluster, Bronze Star, and Air Force Commendation Medal. Richard Cole.
Colonel Dick Cole.
Yes, ma'am.
What's your favorite plane that you flew?
I've had a lot of people ask me that, but once you're hooked on aviation, why, all of them.
Yes, sir.
How confident was he when they were taking off as being the first plane off the carrier?
Did you hear that? How confident were you when you were sitting on the deck fixing to take off the carrier?
When we were at Eglin Field doing our training, we had taken off at the same load off of the runway that was marked off with the carrier marking, and we only had a 10-knot wind, and we did that for maybe a couple of weeks every day, and so we were pretty confident. I had a little bit of an advantage because I was sitting next to probably the best pilot in the world at that time. So.
How did you get to be on Doolittle's crew?
I don't know how many of you people believe in luck, but that's all it was. I was screwed up with another pilot, and halfway through the training, he became ill and was disqualified. The day that he was disqualified, Colonel Doolittle came into Eglin Field, and all he did was take that gentleman's seat. Of course, I went along with it.
Yes, sir.
Tell the story of what happened after you landed.
After he bailed out over China? Yeah. Roughly a brief, what happened after you bailed out over China?
After we bailed out, which was about 9 o'clock at night, in the middle of a big, very active warm front, lots of rain and lightning and so forth. The big worry was what you were going to hit after you bailed out. We didn't know what kind of terrain it was or anything. And our crew, everybody bailed out safely, and the next morning we all had compasses, and we started walking west, and by evening all of us were together, even though we bailed out at different times, and we were all together, and the Chinese had picked us up and taken us to a place where we could sleep and had a little bit of food.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Let's go with this one.
How was your reaction by the Chinese as you were making your way to China?
How were the reaction of the Chinese?
People.
What was the reaction of the people, the Chinese people, as you were making your way through China to leave? How were the Chinese people towards you and the crew?
Well, we had a little trouble at first because they were pretty dubious about where we came from. It wasn't publicized in any way, and we all landed in rural areas. But when we finally did meet up with somebody that could speak a little English, they formed a team of other people that they knew that could speak a little English, and it was through those people that we were kept ahead of the Japanese till we got to a place which was outside of the occupied territory.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. How unnerving was it to have to launch ahead of schedule so early, so many beyond the point that you're supposed to launch? How unnerving was that?
How was it when you had to launch early? You know, was it unnerving? You know, to know that you had to go early.
Even though we got an early takeoff time, it wasn't entirely a surprise. We were going to be leaving the next day anyway, but we didn't know exactly what time. Colonel Doolittle wanted to take off on the 19th at dusk, so we could fly all night, and we had incendiary bombs. And our job was to light up Tokyo with the incendiary bombs, and also to give the airplanes that were going to go down to Nagoya and Kobe some form of reference. After flying all night, we hoped to land at a place where they would have a gasoline. And we could gas up and go on into farther west in China, presumably to end up at the same airfield that the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, was operating out of.
Yes, sir. Doolittle, how did your taste of Navy life on the Hornet compare with your Army life at Air Base or other places you served?
How did your life on the Hornet, being with the Navy, compare to Army life? Did I say that right?
It wasn't much different, except you were on a moving platform instead of Erland platform. The Navy treated us very well. Some of them were a little upset because they didn't have places for us to sleep. And so we upset their routine a little bit with having cots in the companionways and cluttering up the mess line. But you know, they couldn't do enough for us.
Yes, sir.
What did he do after the war?
What do you do after the war? What'd you do after the war?
After the war, I became a citrus farmer in southern Texas. And did that for 16 years. And had a very nice time. A lot of work, but it was good living.
What'd you do after the raid? What'd you do after the raid?
After the raid, we happened to be in the China-Burma area, which is under the 10th Air Force, which was stationed back in New Delhi, India, for about couple thousand miles. And things were pretty loose. That was the end of the supply line. The Japanese had cut the Burma Road, which was the only road that you could get into China by at that time. When they cut the line by conquering Rangoon, Burma, China was isolated. They had to do something else, so they thought about establishing an air link between northwest India and China. And there were 6 of us that decided that they were looking there, when they were looking for pilots, we volunteered to go on the hump. And we flew the hump for 14 months before we got to come home.
Oh, the C-47. Yes, sir. Yeah, they were spotted by an enemy controller. Then expected. That's when it became a suicide mission because they didn't have enough fuel. They knew they didn't have enough fuel. People think it was a suicide mission from day one. It wasn't. They had plans to fly over land. They had beacons that were going to be set up. They were going to have all that, but they had to take off early because they were spotted by a Japanese controller, mission controller. Yeah. As a pilot, how did you feel about leaving early off the carrier when you were spotted?
I don't think all of us had any real bad thoughts about having to leave early. We knew where we were going, and we'd been trained for it, and it was our job. And it just happened to be about 9 hours earlier. But when we look back on it, some of the things that added up to an advantage, it wasn't all bad, and all of us were able to make it to China, except one that had extra heavy gas consumption. The pilot made up his mind to go to Russia, which he did, and they landed, and the Russians put him in the house arrest for 14 months.
The only reason why they made China, for probably most of you know, is they had a tailwind. They ended up going into a thunderstorm, and it literally pushed them over. Otherwise, they would have had to crash land, bail out at sea. What did General Doolittle?
What did General Doolittle say, or as a crew, when you're heading toward Japan and you might run out of gas over the ocean?
After we left Japan, and we're maybe 4 hours into the flight, the navigator, Hank Potter, passed a note up to us that according to his figures, we're going to end up 180 miles short of the China coast. And at that time, Colonel Doolittle figured he didn't have to say anything because all he said is, we'll go through our ditching procedure, which we did. And afterwards, we just kept flying. And we began to notice the water changing in color. Instead of a dark green, it began to have a little brown tint to it. And we thought maybe we were getting close to land. Well, what happened is that the big warm front that was over China on the upside of the mission had developed what they called divine wind, or kamikaze wind, where the wind was blowing from the east to the west. And it created a tailwind. We couldn't tell it, but when we came to the point where Hank said we'd be out of gas, we still had the gas. And so we just kept flying, and we were fortunate enough to make it to China. And, just barely, but that was very important.
What about if you ditched by a ship, whether it's friendly or enemy? Did Colonel Doolittle, did he make a comment to you? That's what I'm trying to get him to.
He realized that we really had nothing to fight with, but he said we're going to do it anyway. But, if we land by a friendly vessel, they'll take us to a board and we'll get to a friendly port. If we have to land by an enemy vessel, we will attempt to take over that vessel and get to a friendly port with 5 automatic pistols.
Yes, sir. You in the back. You haven't had one yet.
What do you think about being portrayed in movies?
Oh. What do you think about being portrayed in the movies? About being betrayed in the movies? You know, like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. The great.
Well, I don't know much about the first movie, which was 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, because we're still overseas. And the only thing I can say about the later one called Pearl Harbor was probably the most incorrect historical review of the whole thing. The first movie with Spencer Tracy was the best pick of an individual to be Colonel Doolittle. And I can't say the same thing for the other members.
Yes, sir. In the blue.
What did it mean? How important was it? What did it mean to all the aircrew to have Colonel Doolittle flying, leading the mission with you? How important was that?
How important was it that Doolittle, all the men saw Doolittle to be able to fly with him? Did I understand? Colonel Doolittle, then, how was it all the people looked up at him and saw him as being their leader? How did that feel, or what was amongst the men?
I was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, and as a kid I used to ride my bicycle to a place that the Army Air Forces had a base called McCook Field, and you could sit on the river levee and watch what the Army Air Corps pilots were doing. And a lot of times, one of the pilots that you were looking at was Jimmy Doolittle, along with Spats and all the rest of the old timers. I had made up my mind early on that I was either going to be a Army Air Corps pilot or a Force Ranger. When I graduated from high school in the beginning of the Depression in 1933, jobs were not too plentiful, and so forth. I went to work on a farm, for 3 years. Saved enough money to enter college. You know, while I was in college, the Army, or Uncle Sam, had offered a program of he would pay for your flying training up to a private flying license. And that's how I was able to get into the Army Air Force.
Well, we got about 3 more minutes. I'll probably take 2, maybe 3 more questions. Yes, sir.
Did you encounter any Japanese aircraft during the mission?
Did you encounter any Japanese aircraft during the mission?
We were flying over Japan. We flew the whole mission between, let's say, an average height of 200 feet. And the only time we were above that altitude was on a bombing mission. We pulled up to 1,500, dropped the bomb, and went back down on the deck. Over Japan, we saw quite a few airplanes above it, but I don't think they ever saw us because we were not jumped. Some of the later airplanes were jumped by Japanese fighters, but none of them damaged any of the airplanes or shot any of them down. So we don't know what they were doing.
1 or 2 more? Yes, sir.
How many planes was it that never made it back, or how many crews didn't make it back from the mission? And what percentage of guys survived?
Well, there was eight that were captured. There was 8 that were captured. 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 died of beriberi because they were in 40 months of solitary confinement, and 4 came home. There's a book called 4 Came Home. It's really interesting. It was on Amazon. It shows unavailable, but if you look up the publisher, they have it. So it's like $15. It's an awesome book. It's called 4 Came Home. And then 1 died on bailout, and I believe 2 drowned trying to get to shore. 1 more? Yes, sir.
When he was flying, much conversation was happening on the way to Japan. And what did he do as a co-pilot versus what Jimmy Doolittle did?
When you were flying to Japan, what kind of conversations did you have with, like, the general? And
Is that correct, sir? Is that what you meant?
you know, what did you guys talk about? Was there a lot of quiet time, or did you actually do a lot of talking?
The only conversation flying the mission came from him. You have to remember that I was a brand new second lieutenant, and at that time you didn't speak unless you were spoken to. Actually, it was very quiet. There was a lot on his mind, and you could almost see the wheels turning. He wasn't one for chit-chat, and there wasn't really much to talk about because of I guess the temperament of the time, and he thought maybe his thinking would be better off not to be talking.
The second part of the question was flying-wise. Did you guys swap flying a lot, or did he fly mostly, or did you, or equally, or how'd you split up who was flying the plane?
That part of it was easy. First off, he wasn't what we would call in aviator language a time hog. He was happy to split off and so forth. The other thing was that we did not have automatic pilots. Some of the airplanes did, but we didn't. We had mixtures on the engines lean back to a critical point. So one of us had to watch the tachometer. Once the tachometer started to jiggle and go back and forth, it was getting ready to quit. Somebody had to watch it. And because you don't want to lose an engine that's a couple hundred feet. So I guess that answers the question.
Okay, Colonel Cole's going to be here all weekend over by the hangar over here. It's a white tent, blue and white tent over here. He does sell a print called Payback. It's his crew's airplane. All proceeds go to the Doolittle Raider Scholarship Fund. That's one thing General Doolittle never wanted to use the Doolittle name as profit. And to my knowledge or anybody's knowledge, no Raider has ever done that. All the money has gone to proceeds for scholarships in aviation. It's just amazing if someone added up all the money over the years. Because every year at their reunions, they've always raised money. And they always had to go to a city that was for non-profit. They couldn't make profit off the name. And to this day, Colonel Cole travels around to sell that print and still get money for the scholarship fund.
The 501c3.
501c3. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, and give it up to Colonel Cole.
Thank you.